What happens when Keanu Reeves, Hollywood's quiet legend, walks into a room and gets dismissed as a nobody? Picture this, a slick real estate office, dripping with luxury, where sharp suits and sharper judgments rule the day. One agent makes a call that's about to blow up in her face, and Keanu? He's got a secret up his sleeve that'll leave everyone scrambling. Was it a clash of egos, a power play gone wrong, or something way juicier? You won't believe how this unfolds. Stick around, because the truth is wilder than the headlines. Keanu Reeves stood quietly at the edge of a pristine real estate office, his long hair falling over his face, his gray shirt slightly wrinkled and worn. He looked out of place among the glossy brochures, shining marble floors, and real estate agents dressed in their sharpest suits. No one knew who he was. No one cared. And yet, something incredible was about to happen. Something that would leave everyone in the room stunned and make one person deeply regret their actions. Keanu wasn't interested in luxury. He wasn't drawn to gold-plated faucets, imported chandeliers, or designer kitchen countertops. He wanted a home, not a status symbol. His eyes wandered to the photos of houses on display, searching for one that spoke to him. But before he could get far, a voice cut through the air, sharp and dismissive. The woman standing behind the sleek, modern desk was a real estate agent, dressed in a fitted blue suit and expensive heels. She glanced up at Keanu, her gaze flickering with instant judgment. He looked like he didn't belong. He looked homeless. She sighed dramatically before rolling her eyes. "Can I help you?" The words dripped with impatience. Keanu didn't react. He simply nodded and pointed at a modest home in one of the glossy brochures. A small, classic house, simple, unpretentious. It wasn't the most expensive on the list. In fact, it was one of the cheapest. The agent barely concealed her smirk. "That house," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "Are you sure you're in the right place? We sell high-end properties here, not," she waved a manicured hand, "budget homes for people looking to make do." A few people in the office chuckled under their breath. The receptionist, a young man tapping away at his computer, smirked as he side-eyed the situation. A client sitting in one of the leather chairs flipped through a brochure, but was clearly eavesdropping. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying the agent. He was used to people underestimating him. He had seen arrogance like this before, judgment based on appearances. But he wasn't here to argue. He was here for a house. Still, the agent wasn't done. She leaned on the desk, tapping a pen against the polished wood. "Look, sir," she said in a tone that barely masked her irritation. "This isn't some open house where you just walk in and pick something off a shelf. Buying a home requires serious financial commitment. Credit checks, mortgage approvals, down payments. Are you even pre-approved?" A chuckle rippled through the air. Keanu remained unfazed. The real estate agent let out a small, amused huff and turned toward her manager, who had been watching the exchange from across the room. The manager, an older man in a navy blue suit, had seen enough. His brows furrowed as he watched his employee's behavior. Something in his expression shifted. Before the agent could continue her humiliation, the manager stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'll take care of this," he said. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent. The agent gave him a puzzled glance. "Sir, I don't think." But the manager had already turned to Keanu, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Reeves," he said smoothly, "it's an honor. Please, let me personally assist you." The agent's face paled. The receptionist stopped typing. The client in the waiting area straightened in their chair, suddenly paying very close attention. Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable, and followed the manager toward his office. The agent stood frozen, realization washing over her like a cold wave. She had just humiliated one of the most famous, respected actors in the world, and she was about to regret it. Keanu walked alongside the manager, the polished floors of the real estate office gleaming beneath their feet. The air inside the office had shifted. What was once filled with quiet amusement at the agent's ridicule was now thick with stunned silence. The employees stole glances, whispering among themselves. The receptionist who had smirked earlier now sat stiffly, typing slower, as if hoping to blend into the background. The agent in the blue suit, still standing at her desk, gripped the edge of the counter, her nails tapping anxiously. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. As they moved deeper into the office, past rows of cubicles and private meeting rooms, Keanu remained composed. He had dealt with people like this before. The ones who judged too quickly, who measured a person's worth based on how they looked rather than who they were. It never surprised him, but it always disappointed him. The manager opened a door to his personal office, a large yet simple space, with a wooden desk and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. He gestured for Keanu to sit. Keanu took in the view, but didn't rush to sit down. Instead, he turned toward a framed award on the manager's wall, a plaque recognizing years of excellence in real estate. It was clear the man was respected in his industry, but something about him seemed different from the other employees. He didn't carry the arrogance that had filled the air when Keanu first walked in. The manager finally spoke, his voice measured. He didn't apologize for the agent outright, but his words carried weight. His company had a reputation to uphold, and that encounter at the front desk was not a reflection of it. Keanu nodded once. He wasn't the type to demand apologies or make a scene. He wasn't here for that. He was here to buy a house. The manager pulled out a file, flipping through a few pages before selecting a different set of listings. Unlike the agent earlier, he didn't push the overpriced properties or the ones meant to impress. Instead, he laid out a few options that aligned with what Keanu had been looking at. A home with character, not just one with a hefty price tag. Keanu took his time scanning the properties. He didn't ask about the brand of tiles in the bathroom or whether the countertops were imported from Italy. He wanted to know about the structure, the neighborhood, the history of the house. These were the things that mattered. Back at the main lobby, the agent in the blue suit paced near her desk, her mind racing. She had made a mistake, a huge one. Her earlier arrogance now felt like a trap tightening around her. She had assumed too much, judged too fast. The receptionist kept his eyes glued to his screen, avoiding any acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. The clients waiting in the seating area had also taken notice, their hushed voices carrying an air of disbelief. The realization was settling in across the room. Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood icon, had just been treated like he was beneath their time. Minutes passed. The manager's office door remained closed. The agent clenched her jaw, her anxiety growing. The thought of her boss walking out and reprimanding her in front of everyone made her stomach twist. Finally, after what felt like forever, the door opened. The manager stepped out first, followed by Keanu. Their conversation had been short but effective. A decision had been made. The agent stiffened. She watched as Keanu walked past her without a glance, his expression unreadable. The manager, however, stopped beside her, his tone quiet but firm. Keanu reached the exit, pushing the glass door open, stepping onto the sidewalk. The sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement. He took a slow breath, his mind settled. But inside, the office remained tense. The weight of regret settled heavily on the agent's shoulders. The humiliation she had dished out so freely had now returned tenfold. And she knew, this was a mistake she wouldn't soon forget. Keanu Reeves stepped onto the busy sidewalk, the sounds of passing cars and distant conversations filling the air. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city. Despite the unpleasant encounter inside, he remained composed, his expression unreadable. He had no reason to be angry. He had seen this kind of judgment before, and it never affected him the way people expected. It wasn't his loss. Inside the real estate office, however, the air was thick with tension. The agent in the blue suit stood frozen at her desk, her hands resting on the counter, her knuckles slightly pale from gripping it too hard. The manager had already walked away, his figure retreating into the depths of the office, his presence now only a shadow in the background. He had said little to her, but he didn't have to. The damage was done. The receptionist kept his head low, avoiding her gaze, while the other employees whispered among themselves. Clients who had been waiting now looked at her differently, some glancing toward the entrance as if expecting Keanu to return. The weight of their judgment pressed against her chest. She exhaled sharply, adjusting her blazer as if that small act could restore the confidence she had lost. How had she let this happen? It was supposed to be a routine day, another predictable client interaction. A few dismissive words, a little sarcasm. It was nothing she hadn't done before. But this was different. This wasn't just anyone. She turned away from the watching eyes, pretending to organize a stack of property brochures on her desk. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through them, her mind replaying the moment when the manager had called Keanu by name, his voice steady, his words weighted with respect. Keanu Reeves. How had she not recognized him? She had seen his movies, knew of his reputation, kind, humble, nothing like the typical Hollywood elite. And yet, she had treated him as if he were nothing. A nobody. The embarrassment burned through her. The weight of it only deepened when she looked at the listings on her desk. She remembered how he had pointed to the modest house, the one she had scoffed at. He wasn't drawn to the lavish estates she had been trained to sell. He wasn't impressed by grandeur, by excess. He had been looking for something real, and she had laughed at him for it. She swallowed, her throat dry. Outside, through the glass doors, she could still see him. He hadn't walked far. He stood near the curb, his gaze focused on something in the distance, his posture relaxed, as if he had already forgotten about the entire interaction. But she hadn't, and she wouldn't. Something inside her twisted, a deep, unfamiliar feeling she wasn't used to. Regret. She had built her career on reading people, on understanding what kind of homes they wanted before they even said it. It was how she closed deals, how she had climbed the ranks in the office. But for the first time, she had failed. Not because she didn't know what he wanted, but because she never bothered to ask. Her gaze dropped to the counter, where the brochure still lay open, the small house staring back at her. It wasn't grand. It wasn't something that would appear on the cover of a luxury magazine. But there was a quiet charm to it, an authenticity. She could almost picture Keanu there, sitting on the porch, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. She let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers against her temple. A sudden thought struck her. Would he still want the house after what had happened? Would he walk away from it, just like he had walked away from her? The idea unsettled her more than she expected. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she straightened her posture and stepped out from behind the counter. The murmurs in the office grew softer as people watched her move toward the exit. She ignored them, pushing open the glass door, stepping outside where the city's hum wrapped around her. Keanu was still there. The streetlights had flickered on, casting a warm glow over the sidewalk. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her presence. Her heart pounded in a way it hadn't before. Not from confidence, not from control, but from something else entirely. And for the first time in a long time, she felt small. The cool evening air settled over the city, a stark contrast to the heat simmering inside the real estate agent's chest. She had never been the type to second-guess herself, never the type to feel the weight of regret creeping up her spine. And yet, as she stepped outside, her confidence, the armor she had always worn so effortlessly, felt like it was beginning to crack. Keanu stood just a few steps away, hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his worn jeans. He seemed at ease, unfazed by everything that had just happened. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, wasn't hailing a cab, wasn't even looking in her direction. He simply stood there, as if the world was moving around him, but he wasn't in a rush to move with it. For a fleeting second, she considered turning back. The door behind her was still within reach. She could go inside, pretend this moment never happened, let the mistake settle into a lesson for herself and move on. But something about him, about the way he carried himself after everything, made it impossible to ignore. She cleared her throat, a useless attempt to steady herself. The sound barely rose above the noise of the street, but Keanu shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence without looking at her directly. It was almost worse than if he had ignored her completely. Her mouth opened, but words didn't come. It was rare for her to be at a loss. She had spent years in this business perfecting the art of persuasion, of using her voice to control the narrative. But this wasn't a business deal. It wasn't a closing negotiation. It was something else entirely. Keanu's posture remained unchanged, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. But she could feel it, the quiet expectation in the air. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't about saving face anymore. It wasn't about smoothing over a professional misstep or trying to undo the embarrassment she had caused herself. That moment had passed. The judgment, the condescension, it was already out there, and no amount of damage control would erase it. But she had to face it. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like, and let's keep going. The streetlights above hummed softly, their glow casting long shadows across the pavement. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a cafe nearby, mingling with the city's usual mix of exhaust and late-night energy. It was one of those moments where time seemed to slow, where the weight of something unspoken settled between two people. For the first time that day, she forced herself to really think, not about her job, not about closing deals, not about how she had been trained to assess clients the moment they walked in. She thought about him. He had walked in, not demanding attention, not flashing wealth, not proving himself. He had simply existed, looking for something real, something meaningful. And she had dismissed him, because in her world, people were sorted into categories the moment they stepped through the door. And she had put him in the wrong one. Keanu finally turned his head slightly, his profile catching the soft glow of the streetlights. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, quiet eyes, held something that made her breath hitch. She had expected disapproval, maybe a hint of amusement at her regret. But there was none of that. Instead, there was something worse. Indifference. Not cold, not cruel, just detached. Like someone who had seen this all before, who knew how the world worked, and had long stopped being surprised by it. And that, more than anything, made her stomach sink. She had assumed he would remember her, that she was significant in some way in this interaction. But the truth settled in her chest like a weight. He wasn't thinking about her at all. She was just another person who had judged too quickly. Another face in a long line of people who had made assumptions about him. And soon he would move on, carrying none of this with him. But she would. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the sharp fabric of her blazer brushing against her skin. The city around them pulsed with movement, cars rolling past, pedestrians weaving between sidewalks, conversations humming in the background. Life moved forward, and for the first time in a long time, she realized she was standing still. The city moved around them, an endless current of life, cars streaking by, people lost in their own conversations, the rhythmic footsteps of strangers weaving through the sidewalks. But for the real estate agent, none of it seemed to register. The world kept moving, yet she remained still, anchored in the weight of her own realization. Keanu stood a few feet away, seemingly detached from the moment. There was no tension in his stance, no expectation in his expression. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't acknowledging her presence beyond the brief glance he had given her earlier. And yet, that indifference cut deeper than any harsh words ever could. She had spent her career perfecting how to be seen. Every interaction, every sale, every carefully curated appearance. Everything was designed to make people notice her, respect her, seek her out. But in this moment, standing here beneath the hum of streetlights, she felt invisible. A gust of wind sent a few loose strands of her hair whipping across her face, but she barely reacted. Her mind was somewhere else, unraveling the events of the past hour in painful clarity. She thought about the way she had dismissed him, how easily the words had left her lips, how quickly she had categorized him as someone unworthy of her time. It wasn't personal, not to her at least. It was just how the business worked, or so she had believed. Now, as she stood there, the weight of her own arrogance pressing down on her, she realized how wrong she had been. Keanu hadn't needed her validation. He hadn't needed her approval. He had walked into that office knowing exactly what he was looking for. And she, so caught up in her assumptions, in the illusion of control she had over clients, had humiliated herself more than she had humiliated him. Her breath was slow, steady, but inside she felt restless. The real estate industry had molded her into someone who could read people in seconds. A glance at a client's watch, their shoes, the way they carried themselves, it told her everything she needed to know. She had trained herself to sort them into categories, to anticipate what they wanted before they even asked. But Keanu had defied that system. He had walked in, wearing nothing that signaled wealth, carrying no airs of importance, and yet he had effortlessly dismantled the shallow criteria she had relied on for so long. And now, he was about to walk away. She felt it before it happened. The shift in his stance, the way his weight adjusted as he prepared to step forward. The realization tightened around her like a vice. For the first time in years, she had no idea what to do. There was no sales tactic for this, no carefully crafted response that could undo what had already been said. She wasn't trained for this, for the silence, for the weight of self-awareness pressing into her chest. Keanu took a step forward, and something inside her cracked. Her fingers twitched at her sides, the fabric of her blazer stiff beneath her touch. The air between them felt impossibly heavy, stretched thin by everything left unsaid. She had spent her entire career moving forward, never hesitating, never looking back. But now, she was frozen, watching as the one person who had unknowingly held a mirror up to her actions was about to disappear into the city without a second thought. She had dismissed him as unimportant. And now, she was the one being left behind. A hollow feeling settled in her stomach. Keanu continued walking, each step carrying him further away from the moment she had desperately wanted to rewrite. The streetlights above flickered slightly. A neon sign across the road buzzed, illuminating the wet pavement in electric blue hues. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the internal storm brewing inside her. For the first time in her life, she felt what it was like to be on the other side of a closed door. And she wasn't sure she liked it. The streetlights stretched a shadow along the pavement as Keanu walked away, disappearing into the city's endless motion. The real estate agent stood frozen, her arms stiff at her sides, her thoughts unraveling into a restless spiral. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was used to control, to orchestrating situations with ease, always knowing exactly what to say, how to redirect, how to recover. Clients left her desk feeling convinced, impressed, even grateful. That was her skill, an ability to shape the outcome before it had even unfolded. But this time, there was no second chance, no clever way to steer the narrative back in her favor. The moment had passed. The decision had already been made, and Keanu was gone. The city swallowed him effortlessly, as if he had never been there at all. Her breath hitched slightly, though she forced herself to steady it. The weight of humiliation didn't just sit on her shoulders, it pressed into her chest, tightening with every second that ticked by. She turned sharply, heading back inside the office, pushing through the glass doors with more force than necessary. The moment she stepped inside, the energy of the space felt different. The receptionist barely looked up, pretending to be focused on his screen. The few lingering clients stole quick glances at her, their eyes darting away when she met their gaze. The whispered conversations had died down, but their silence carried just as much weight. She didn't like it. She moved toward her desk, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her movements precise and deliberate. If she was going to recover from this, she needed to act like it never happened. The brochures were still sitting there, one of them still open to the house Keanu had pointed at. The image stared back at her, the modest, understated home completely at odds with the extravagant properties she normally pushed onto her clients. She shut the brochure with a sharp flick of her wrist, as if closing it could erase the memory. But it was still there. The way he had looked at her, not with anger, not with amusement, but with something worse. Indifference. The manager's presence loomed in the background, his silhouette shifting through the hallways, saying nothing but watching everything. He hadn't reprimanded her, hadn't lectured her, but she could feel the silent weight of his disappointment pressing down on her like a slow-building storm. She inhaled sharply, willing herself back into focus. Work. She needed to focus on work. She glanced at her schedule, flipping through her planner, but the words blurred together. Her mind kept circling back, dragging her back to the one thing she wanted to forget. Keanu wasn't the first person she had dismissed. There had been countless others. People who didn't look like they belonged, people she had sized up in a matter of seconds and brushed aside without a second thought. And she had never cared. Until now. Her hands curled into fists against the desk, nails pressing into her palms. She hated this feeling, this unease clawing at the edges of her carefully constructed confidence. She had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, of keeping emotions out of business. But this wasn't business anymore. This was something else entirely. The streetlights outside cast their glow through the glass windows, illuminating the space with a soft, golden hue. Outside, the city continued without pause, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She exhaled, slow and deliberate. For the first time in her career, she had miscalculated. And worse, she didn't know how to fix it. And that, more than anything, made her feel powerless. The city outside the office was alive, indifferent to the turmoil unfolding inside her mind. Cars sped by in streaks of light, pedestrians weaved through the sidewalks, and the distant hum of conversations blurred into the background. But inside, beneath the artificial glow of the ceiling lights, the real estate agent sat rigid at her desk, her hands hovering motionless above the brochures she had organized out of habit. The papers were crisp, the folders perfectly aligned. Everything in place, except her thoughts. Her mind refused to let go. Keanu Reeves had walked into her office, and she had brushed him off like he was nothing. Then, just as easily, he had walked out, carrying nothing but the quiet indifference of a man who had seen this happen before. And that was what haunted her. It wasn't anger. He hadn't argued, hadn't tried to prove himself, hadn't demanded respect. That would have been easier to deal with. A client pushing back, getting defensive, she knew how to handle that. But he had simply looked at her, studied her, and then dismissed her without a second thought. The way she had dismissed him. The realization twisted inside her. She had been the one holding the power in that moment. At least, she had believed so. But in the end, she had lost it completely. The office had settled into a lull, the usual evening chatter reduced to murmurs. The receptionist occasionally glanced at her, but said nothing. She knew they had all witnessed what happened, even if no one dared to acknowledge it directly. The manager had disappeared deeper into the building, his shadow no longer looming, but his silence still weighed on her more than any reprimand could have. She wasn't used to this feeling, this quiet, gnawing discomfort that she couldn't shake off. Selling real estate was never personal. It was business, transactions, numbers. She had spent years perfecting the ability to judge people quickly, to anticipate their desires before they even spoke. But Keanu hadn't fit into any of those categories. And now, she was left with nothing but an unsettling sense of failure. A deal lost wasn't a new experience for her. Some clients walked away. Some found a better offer elsewhere. But this wasn't about a house. It wasn't about losing a sale. It was about losing control of the moment. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the desk. For the first time in a long time, she felt out of place in her own office. The space that had always given her confidence now felt constricting. The sleek, modern furniture, the perfectly curated atmosphere. It all felt performative, like a stage where she had played the same role for years without question. But tonight, that role felt hollow. Keanu had walked in, not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a person searching for something real. And she had failed to see it. The more she thought about it, the more the regret settled in. Not because she had embarrassed herself, she had dealt with setbacks before, but because she had made a mistake that went beyond business. She had misjudged a person, and she wasn't sure how to reconcile that with the version of herself she had built over the years. The sounds of the city filtered through the large glass windows, the rhythm of life continuing uninterrupted. She glanced outside, half expecting to see him again, standing beneath the glow of the streetlights. But of course he was gone. Just like that, the moment had passed. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair, eyes flickering toward the empty doorway where the manager had stood earlier. His silence had spoken volumes. He had seen everything, yet he had said nothing. Because what was there to say? The lesson had already been learned. She had built a career on understanding people, on knowing what they wanted before they did. And yet, when it mattered most, she had understood nothing at all. The weight of that realization settled in her chest as she reached for the brochure. The one Keanu had pointed at, the home that had caught his eye despite its lack of grandeur. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then, without a word, she slipped it into her drawer. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she just wasn't ready to forget. Outside, the city moved on, but inside something had shifted. And she knew this moment would stay with her far longer than she had expected. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.